Good evening and welcome to Peter Harrington and our Harry Potter nights. First of all, I just want to say thank you to the people that made it here tonight, because if those who don't know, outside of the UK, major train strike, tube strike, everyone's on a strike, it's impossible to get anywhere. So I appreciate you guys turning up tonight. And this actually is the first of, there's actually a couple of events we're going this week. We're also doing another event at Fulham Road this week on Thursday to launch our children's collection. And then next week we'll be exhibiting at Masterpiece. So life is returning back to normal with events that we can meet customers and show you lovely books. I'm going to introduce you to Phil Errington. Phil has been with us for just over a year now and was 21 years at Sotheby's. But most importantly for tonight, he is the bibliographer for J.K. Rowling and all the Harry Potter material. And we thought it'd be a great opportunity for people to learn a bit about the history of Harry Potter publishing, collecting first editions. And welcome, Phil. I'm going to hand over.
Thank you very much, Bob. We are all collectors, whether we collect stamps, postcards, cars, impressionist paintings, wives. I've narrowly avoided collecting points on a driving license. Everyone is a collector, but of course, more sensibly, we want to know about book collectors. There's no need for me to rhapsodize on the glories of book collecting. I'm in the right place with the right company. Remember the wise words of Walt Disney, who said, "There is more treasure in books than in all the pirates' loot on Treasure Island and at the bottom of the Spanish Main." Or slightly more mainstream, Jane Austen and Miss Bingley in Pride and Prejudice says, "I declare, after all, there is no enjoyment like reading. How much sooner one tires of anything than of a book. When I have a house of my own, I should be miserable if I have not an excellent library." Okay, that's not the greatest source, because Miss Bingley, as you probably know, isn't a terribly sympathetic character in Pride and Prejudice, but you get the picture. Let's turn to the wizarding world of J.K. Rowling. It's Hermione Granger, who's the bookish scholar. Remember that Ron notes Hermione's belief that when in doubt, go to the library. So, combining books and collecting, here we are with Harry Potter at Peter Harrington, or HP at PH, as I've been calling it. The earliest record on our database dates from August 1999, but that's simply because earlier records aren't preserved. We sold our first Philosopher's Stone in hardback in 2000 for £13,000, a staggering figure to contemplate now. Incidentally, if anyone's interested, we currently have an inscribed paperback and an uninscribed paperback in stock. In late 1999, I joined the book trade within an auction house, and with that experience, combined with those of my Harrington colleagues, particularly Pom, Pablo, Kevin, Theo, Luke, and Joe, that brings a combined experience of roughly 128 years. And of course, the Peter Harrington team also includes J.K. Rowling, bibliographer. So this evening is in 4 parts. Fabled first editions, a few personal highlights. I'll talk about the bibliography, and then towards the end, we'll have our special guest appearance from Barry Cunningham. Barry, unfortunately, has been plagued by the train strikes, and so we'll be dialing in, as it were. So, Fabled first editions. What is a first edition? Well, in the simplest terms, as you'll see here, quoted from John Carter, it's the first appearance of the work in question independently between its own covers. Now, it's slightly more complicated than that. John Carter goes on to say, not actually in this bit, but he goes on to say that an edition comprises all copies of a book printed at any time or times from one setting up of type without substantial change. So with Harry Potter, that's what you're looking for in the Philosopher's Stone. You've got the strike line 10 down to 1. The 10 down to 2 technically means first edition, second impression. And so it goes on, of course. You can pick up a Harry Potter and it may say 30, 31. It's a 30th impression. They're all technically first editions. But at Peter Harrington, we very firmly state first edition, first impression, for avoidance of doubt. Some basic stuff. There are 3 significant titles: Philosopher's Stone, Chamber of Secrets, and Prisoner of Azkaban. Why are those significant ones? It's to do with the print run. Goblets of Fire, there were 750,000 copies, and by the time we get to the last one in the series, Deathly Hallows, we're at 8 million copies. So the significant issue, as I said, is the first edition, first impression. It's not complicated. In my bibliography, you can't possibly read that, I'm afraid. I actually did a flow chart of where you would go, yes or no. There are all sorts of little avenues you can fall down, but essentially, we're talking about the first 3 books and first edition, first impression. As I say, the significant factor is the size of the edition.
Look at the print runs for some other favourite children's books. Winnie the Pooh, 30,000 copies from 1926. Swallows and Amazons, 2,000 copies in 1930. The Box of Delights, 7,500 copies in 1935. And The Hobbit, 1,500 in 1937.
Contrast that with 500 hardback and 5,150 paperback of Philosopher's Stone. They were both published on the same day, neither has priority. Contrast that with the second book, Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets, of which there were 706 copies, as confirmed by the publishers. That can't possibly be right. More of that later. Stay tuned for a revelation, which you'll see whether you're still awake later on. Prisoner of Azkaban, moving on to the third one in the series, there were 5,150 copies. But of course, with this book, there's a significant factor, which is about printing errors. There's a first and second state. There's also a third state, of which I'll come on to a bit later. Generally, there are thought that there are 2,500 of 7A, the first state. And this is quite interesting. We were looking for that strike line. The bookseller, trade periodical, noted on the 16th of July, just after publication, there are many disappointed customers who have not been able to get hold of first editions of The Prisoner of Azkaban. So even at the time of publication, the books were rare, or at least by the time of the third book, they were sought after. Leads me on to questions of commercial value for the Philosopher's Stone. Until recently, the auction world record for a first edition hardback was 150,000, which I helped establish in May 2013. That's cheating slightly because it was extensively annotated by the author. Now, the auction record is 356,000, which was Heritage Auctions in December 2021. One could devote an entire evening to a discussion of commercial value. How does one price a book? Well, obviously, there are many factors. I'm not going to talk about them all now. Condition, rarity, desirability, and of course, knowledge of the market. But there's one fact here, that the high commercial value in first editions in J.K. Rowling has led to forgeries, both competent and incompetent. There are some extremely fine forgeries, which have fooled auction houses and some dealers. They can be identified, but it brings me to a vital point. Peter Harrington is a dealer with a specialist knowledge and a range of expertise. I've seen a vast quantity of J.K. Rowling material, but so what? It's only significant if colleagues share information, test and discuss material. Happily, we're back at the 128 combined years of experience. And even if we do get it wrong, we have an unconditional guarantee. So, quickly into some personal highlights. Having established a few points about the Fabled first editions, allow me to indulge in a trip down memory lane in some of my favourite Harry Potter pieces in 2 decades within the auction world, and a few recent favourites too. My point is that a great Harry Potter collection has a great deal of scope. This is the advertising board that I had when Sotheby's teamed up with Amazon in about 1999-2000 and offered a Philosopher's Stone inscribed. It was $15,000 to $20,000. Alas, I don't know what it sold for. All the records were lost. But the market quickly realized that the first edition of the first book was a significant item. That led to some trying to guess the next big thing. I wonder whether anyone remembers G.P. Taylor's Shadowmancer from 2002, which everyone thought would be the next Harry Potter. It wasn't. My first big manuscript item was great fun. In 2002, J.K. Rowling was asked to write a postcard for a charity auction after a dinner to raise funds for Book Aid International, and the charity dinner was going to be held at some hotel, and there were invited guests. And the Society of Authors, who organised it all, saw this card and said, you can't possibly sell this in an after-dinner auction. Let's go to a main auction house. And you can't see very much of it there, obviously, because the point was there were 93 words. It would be sold sight unseen. It would tell you a little bit about the plot in the forthcoming Order of the Phoenix, but not very much. And I estimated it at £5,000 to £6,000. I also put it in a sealed envelope. The legal department at Sotheby's hated that because anything that you buy at auctions you should be able to examine. And the point was, of course, that you shouldn't be able to examine this because it would give the game away. So it was all a bit tricky. £5,000 to £6,000 made £24,000 hammer, or as I like to think of it, at £258 a word. That was the beginning of the flurry of Rowling pieces at auction. The point about this was that Jo Rowling never intended it to end up at a main auction house. It raised the profile of her charity, but it started questions about copyright. The Leaky Cauldron, a group of Harry Potter fans on the web, all decided to try and club together to buy it. If they bought it, they were going to put it online. That would have destroyed the copyright in it, so it started asking interesting questions about who owned it and all the rest. Did it have a long-term value? Was the value in the piece only there whilst the secrets were indeed secret, or was it the first insight into a book? It came back to auction in December 2019. I cautiously estimated then at 5,000 to 7,000, and it made 8,000. So I got it wrong again. So there's the comparison. It sold before the Order of the Phoenix was published for £24,000, and it resold at £8,000. I'll leave you to decide rule number one of buying at auction. 2007. There's a very young me with Beadle the Bard. In the final Harry Potter book, there's reference made to the Tales of Beadle the Bard, which is a collection of wizarding fairy tales, which is quite crucial to the plot of the final book. And having written the final book, Jo Rowling decided that there would only be one way of thanking 6 key people who had helped Harry Potter come to fruition, and that would be to give them a copy of the Tales of Beadle the Bard. So she wrote this collection of wizarding fairy tales, and she thought, if I'm writing 6 longhand, I'll do a 7th and sell it at auction. So she wrote 7. The binding was sent to an Edinburgh silversmith. I visited the author at home and discussed what she was planning to do with this. I took it on exhibition to the US, and it appeared on Good Morning America. It had a special catalogue and special badges. A very proud moment was when I said we must have an introduction to this catalogue. And so the text of B15, as I like to call it, the auction catalogue, was dictated to me over the phone. It appeared on This Morning, and even Blue Peter. Yes, I have a Blue Peter badge because I took it on Blue Peter. And there was a lavish reading with a party. So there was a protracted bidding war, which a private individual was mortal combat against Amazon.com. The estimate was 30 to 50,000, and it made 1.95 million. That's still the world record for a modern literary manuscript. The point was it was going to be unpublished. Amazon bought it and started playing around with what they could do. Again, those early questions of copyright came back. So that was the special copy of Beadle the Bard that was created especially for auction. Barry Cunningham, who we'll come to later on, was given 1 copy. And that came to me in December 2016, and I offered that at 300 to 500,000. It sold for 295,000, or 368,750, including buyer's premium. Some of that £73,000 commission was spent on a very lovely video. The carefully edited video had to be run past J.K. Rowling's lawyer on several occasions. But it was the first Beadle Bard that was raised, and the first Beadle was offered to raise money for Lumos, Jo Rowling's charity, and Barry's copy obviously wasn't. Some of the money went to charity indeed. But the first Beadle had exposed several problems, as I said, and the public auction of Rowling material for purely commercial purposes wasn't exactly encouraged. But still, I quite like this extravagant video, which took over a day to shoot and even longer to edit by one of my former colleagues. It's not Warner Brothers, but it's great fun. Now, more recently, Peter Harrington, in my little whirlwind tour of rather lovely items, we have a proof copy of Chamber of Secrets, which I don't know whether you can read. It says, "To Tommy and Davy." That's a lengthy inscription for Joe Rowling. And there's also the suggestion that there's a link with the Weasley twins. Always good when an author will mention her characters in an inscription. Another of my favourites is Thomas Taylor's original Dumbledore. You may know the story that the original artist for the book did a generic wizard who wasn't Dumbledore and was asked to repaint this. I first saw this in July 2001. So it was lovely to see it again in May 2022. It is the wizard which is on the back cover of the 25th anniversary edition. Including the original artist, it's now with its 7th and one suspects long-term owner. It's nice to see it again, but it's even better when it goes to an appropriate home. There we are. That's the comparison between the original wizard and the 25th edition. So moving on, there's another. These items at auction had introduced me to the author, and I played a small role in some remarkable auction successes. But there's another part to the story. Someday, probably in around 2010, a certain distinguished London book dealer by the name of Tom Harrington made an appointment to examine a future auction lot, and the suggestion of a J.K. Rowling bibliography was born. By training, I'm a bibliographer. My PhD was in bibliography of the hugely undervalued John Masefield. So I thought, I have the research methodology, I met the subject, and the Rowling bibliography was born. The dedication was split 7 ways. My wife, children, best friend, PhD supervisor, some of his colleagues, and J.K. Rowling. This was to mirror the dedication in the final Harry Potter book, but there was no space if I was going to do 7. And I rather regret the dedication to some of his colleagues now. So it's time for due acknowledgement and rededication. Tom Harrington, the only begetter of the original idea. Thank you, Tom. So let's briefly look at the joys of bibliography with an eye to collecting. Why? Why on earth does anyone want a bibliography? What's the role and purpose of such things? Well, I say it's to dispel rumours, that's obvious, and correct statement of facts. Here we are with a fact. The first hardback Philosopher's Stone was published in 500 copies on the 26th of June. I also say that the paperback was published in 5,150 copies. Contrast that, which is, I like to think, absolute concrete fact, with an early dealer's catalogue. Thank you to John Ryan for finding this. You see at the bottom, it says the first of the Harry Potter books being one of 500 copies, of which 200 were paper-bound proofs and 300 hardbacks, our copy. So the detail at this point, this is 2000, the detail isn't known. There's no map for what we're doing. Did anyone care less about the J.K. Rowling bibliography? Well, amazingly, made the front cover of Entertainment Weekly. Okay. It's not quite Julia Louis-Dreyfus, but almost. One of the points I like to think about Rowling bibliography, of course, is that it's the last great triumph of book production. My point here is that it's never going to be repeated. You may have midnight openings of bookshops, but you would also have midnight downloads. The book itself was the crucial vehicle in which the text came out. It will never happen again. What were the hurdles to Rowling bibliography? Well, there was a lack of knowledge of the discipline by certain key people who were helping me. There was concern over whether the knowledge was an asset, certain suspicion and dislike of the secondary market. But there was also a lot of potential worry about the brand. Now, quite like talking about the brand. When I did the revised version of the bibliography, I merrily put Harry Potter and the Cursed Child in my B section. B being contribution by rather than the text entirely by. On the title page, it says based on an original story by J.K. Rowling, John Tiffany, and Jack Thorne, a new play by Jack Thorne. There is no author noted on the title page. So I merrily said it was number B22. J.K. Rowling agents view Harry Potter and the Cursed Child as the 8th story in the Harry Potter series. Direct quote, no, this is the 8th story in the Harry Potter series. Very interesting that marketing and branding at this point don't align with the gospel according to Fredson and Bowers, who would have told you precisely where that text would belong. I got away with it, by the way. It is B22 in the published book. The bibliography also revealed certain things about archival research. Now, when I'd done Macefield, I'd done research in the British Library, the Bodleian, the HRC, Columbia University, New York Public Library, and the Heinemann Archive. With J.K. Rowling, there was just the Bloomsbury Archive. I also had interviews with Nigel Newton and Arthur Levine, the English and the American publishers, and also Barry Cunningham, who we'll come to later. But there's very little paper documentation. The earliest thing in the Bloomsbury Archives is a copy of a letter from 1997 from the editor to J.K. Rowling saying, I'm writing with my thoughts on Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets. There is nothing in the Bloomsbury Archives relating to the first book. Now, if you're still awake and online, it's time for the revelation. Should just say that bibliographical revelations aren't actually all that earth-shattering, but there we are. Here's an extract from a Bloomsbury email. You'll see I crossed bits out in red pen, which is when I'd actually put them in the master document. Chamber of Secrets was published in 706 copies. That's what it says. I had a conversation with the CEO of Bloomsbury. I was there with a phone call between the CEO and the printers, and everybody told me that there were 706 copies. But there was another document from Bloomsbury which says that there are 10,150 copies. And that, I think, is the accurate figure. We've got records at Peter Errington for having handled around 90 copies alone. So if you think we've handled 90 out of the 706, I think you're wrong. I think there's got to be 10,000 copies. So there we are, new figure for you. There are 10,150 copies of Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets. Sure, you're thrilled by that. What other issues are raised by the archive? We know about the dust jacket for Philosopher's Stone. There isn't one. But that tells us something about the expectation that hardback copies were destined for libraries. There's an early story that most copies were for libraries, and that's corroborated by the physical evidence. You see a lot of copies have got library stamps in them. But there are no records at Bloomsbury of buyers. We can't check. Similarly, there's no trail in the Bloomsbury archives for the 3 different states of the Prisoner of Azkaban. Indeed, the current thinking is that Errington's 3rd state might be the first Australian edition. So I can uncover problems, but I can't necessarily solve them. Incidentally, the dust jacket for the 3rd state carries a price in pounds, not Australian dollars. So it might be a combination of Australian book and UK dust jacket, but we won't go into that now. I've got one very serious point here, which is a loss to scholarship of turn of the century documents. Bloomsbury's archive has no emails from the first book at any rate. I'm thinking when I left the auction world and asked what they would like in general file, they said only things which are electronic. I had piles of stuff on my desk, and they said, well, unless you scan them, we're not that interested. So they went into the bin. The things to remember is that emails are not letters. Publishers' archives preserve letters, but not emails. Here's a thought for you. Ours is the most photographed time in history, and the one since the birth of photography that creates the smallest number of physical photographs. Your descendants won't find their ancestors in boxes of dusty photos retrieved from the attic, or your photos are safe in the cloud. It depends how you define safe. So aside from the lack of preservation of early electronic documents, are there any other interesting insights? I particularly enjoy the story of a visit I made to New York Public Library in June 2010. I hadn't seen a first US copy of Chamber of Secrets, So a copy, previously known as JFE 037227, had been given special status and reclassified to arrive with a slip, noting it was to be read under supervision. It's very odd because it was a 15th impression. I wonder whether they'd bought it off eBay as a first edition without the person saying it was a 15th. So, of what value is the bibliography, and what does it tell us of interest to collectors? Well, one striking feature that I found about Rowling bibliography are the different editions. This feeds nicely into collecting Potter, of course. The good news is that there's plenty of scope across many price points. Contrast here the first hardback and the first adult paperback. The latest edition of my bibliography, now well out of date, lists 26 different editions of Chamber of Secrets, which is the first title shared by both US and UK. Here we'll see a number of those, but certainly not all 26. There are adult editions, different illustrators, illustrated house colours, and you also see an evolution of the books. Quite soon they start to acquire maps. I think maps in books are quite interesting. Look at Winnie the Pooh to J.R.R. Tolkien. Eventually, a children's book has to have a map, hence end up in Rowling. And I think that tells us something about the contemporary book market and indeed marketing. There's an interesting story, of course, relating to the UK and the US editions. You could choose to collect only US editions. It's a lot easier. What's the story here? Barry can probably fill us in a bit later, but Bloomsbury didn't buy the worldwide rights. So there was an auction for the US rights, and Scholastic secured them for $110,000. If you contrast the two different books, the two different texts, we're talking Philosopher's Stone versus Sorcerer's Stone. There are 80 word changes. There's changes in the use of commas, but every change apparently was discussed with the author. There was concern from a US perspective about changing, about the title. Philosopher's Stone was felt to be a bit dodgy from a sales and marketing perspective, but Sorcerer's Stone was actually an authorial suggestion. And the publisher said they needed the title that said magic more overtly to American readers. So you could, there we are, the American and the English. The other thing I particularly enjoy are proofs. I like proofs. One of my favourite stories from my days in the auction world is Brighton Rock. Here was the publisher's own copy of the proof, A.S. Frere Heinemann. Beautiful copy of the proof, which sold for £2,500 in February 2000. In exactly the same sale, the next lot was the first edition in Dust Jacket, which sold for £16,000, more than 6 times the amount of the proof. There's a lot for my taste, but I'd rather have the proof. There's the first time that Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone turns up between wrappers, and you'll see that the title page says J.A. Rowling. Proofs tell us something about the text, of course. The famous example of collecting J.K. Rowling is The Prisoner of Azkaban. There are 50 purple copies of the proof, and there are 150 or 250 copies of the green proof. So what? Well, the point is that the text is different. In the purple version, you may be able to read that. It says Percy was looking particularly smug, with a new silver badge gleaming on the fez he was wearing over his horn-rimmed glasses. This is much, much longer in the green proof, which is Percy was looking particularly smug. He had pinned his head boy badge to the fez, perched jauntily on top of his neat hair, his horn-rimmed glasses flashing in the Egyptian sun. Far longer text. That's quite interesting. Of course, proofs became a security risk, and then secrecy became part of the marketing. Leading me on with marketing to a few more commercial aspects of the wizarding world. J.K. Rowling bibliography has highlighted, I think, the publishing career of a multi-millionaire with a lucrative movie franchise. The deluxe Goblet of Fire, incidentally, from October 2000, was the first to note the Warner Brothers copyright. And it was pointed out to me the other day that 20% of that print run of the deluxe Goblet of Fire was bought by Peter Errington. The J.K. Rowling's story, of course, had many twists and unexpected revelations. I particularly enjoyed the unmasking of Robert Galbraith, of course. The other point about marketing for Rowling is that the wizarding world has been created, and that allows the publishers to add on additional volumes. So the film scripts, for example, Fantastic Beasts, become part of that wizarding world. It's a marketing umbrella. I should also say that, I said early on, this is the last great triumph of book production as it moves through to ebooks. There were 3 ebooks in 2016, Hogwarts, an incomplete and unreliable guide, short stories from Hogwarts of power, politics and pesky poltergeists, and short stories from Hogwarts of heroism, hardship and dangerous hobbies. And I think the mention of dangerous hobbies, I should tell you that a bibliographer tends to acquire far too many books. Don't try getting into the spare bedroom in my house, or indeed my mother-in-law's loft. My point is that bibliography and collecting are woven together here. Some of you may know that I've got a new project and I'm working on Roald Dahl, which is also a speciality at Peter Harrington. And just as an aside, who links all 3 Errington bibliographies? Not that I've written the 3rd one yet. The answer is Quentin Blake. Quentin Blake illustrated 2 Macefield books. He also illustrated a chapter from Deathly Hallows in a book called The Birthday Book in 2008, which included an extract. And I think it's fascinating to see Quentin Blake draw Voldemort, who said the name, and also Harry Potter. I also believe Quentin Blake has illustrated Roald Dahl, but that's another story. So having returned to the idea of collecting books, you've heard from a collector, a bibliographer, an auctioneer, and thankfully now bookseller. Let's have another angle, that of publisher and editor. Barry Cunningham, I hope you're still there, was formerly a children's marketing director for Puffin, and he'd been asked to write a business plan for Bloomsbury and to develop their children's list. So he was taken on as a consultant. Now the story is, probably stealing his thunder, but he'll correct me if I'm wrong. The story is that at the Frankfurt Book Fair, Christopher Little, who was Joe's agent, and Barry were introduced, and a sample of Philosopher's Stone was submitted to Barry. So it was Barry who proposed to an editorial committee at Bloomsbury that Bloomsbury make an offer on the book, and I believe that was £1,500. So let's hear from Barry. It's described by Joe Rowling as the man who thought an overlong novel about a boy wizarding glasses might just sell. I should say, if you've got a question for Barry, let us know. Rob is fiendishly working away at the back, taking questions down. But let's start with some obvious questions. I'll get Barry on screen for us. Ah, there he is. Barry.
I have indeed, Phil, sprung to life.
Sprung to life. So the
everybody.
First question, can we see him on the screen? Lovely. Barry, I'll introduce you to a virtual audience you can't see them. And indeed, you can't see the real audience here, but they're here nonetheless. So, Barry, the first couple of questions, when did you realize that Harry Potter had a future, as it were? And Joe mentions that the book was overlong. How much was cut? And what's your sense of how long the later books became?
Yeah, well, it's an interesting process. The whole thing just still feels a little like a fairy story, Phil, because it kind of built unexpectedly from the beginning, really. I did know Christopher Little, her original agent, and when he finally sent over the manuscript to me, it was in the days when they sent over manuscripts, physical books. So no ebook submission there, but an actual dog-eared piece of paper, which I have to say I noticed was not completely fresh. So I did notice that it had been round to many other publishers beforehand. So I didn't know, of course, and Christopher, being the agent he was, didn't tell me that everybody else in London had already turned it down. But I suppose reading it, I took it home that night and read it, and I was staying in Soho near the original Bloomsbury office. And I suppose the beginning reminded me of Roald Dahl. Interesting link there with you, because I worked extensively with Roald Dahl when I was at Puffin. So, you know, it felt a little bit like the opening of a Roald Dahl book. But I kind of loved it straight away. I knew that children would love it straight away.
But you were only sent the first chapter, or a small...
No, well, I sent the first chapter at first, and then I rang up and asked for the rest of it. Yeah, so they sent across the
rest. Was the rest of it in a fresher state than the first chapter?
No, sadly not. Sadly not. Right. So yeah, and I thought at the time it obviously was not in any kind of current children's fashion, and it was long, and it had the strange title, so you know it wasn't the most obvious book in the world to buy, but I guess, you know, I always knew that children would love it. Of course, I'd like to tell you I predicted the worldwide phenomenon which would occur, and it was my great judgment. But I didn't. I knew that children would love it. I knew it was important. I knew the friendship was a big and important part. When we were editing, I only suggested a few changes. It was a dream to edit, really. We cut a few chapters, which I didn't keep.
Which I believe going to be one obvious question, but there we are. Moving on.
I don't think she kept either. And we gave up trying to make sense of the rules of Quidditch. Well, I gave up because I said, thing is, Joe, no one will ever play it, of course. So, you know, I never quite understood that. So, yeah, so it was, I did suggest to her that we tried to find another title even then. But she said, you know, just like her namesake Beatrix Potter, it was part of the fascination to use difficult and unusual words. And like good editors everywhere, I went finally with my author's desires. But yeah, and it was all true.
But you had suggested changing it from Philosopher's Stone.
Yeah, I said we should find another title, but we didn't.
So you weren't surprised. You weren't surprised when the American edition comes out as Sorcerer's Stone.
No. But well, you know, it's interesting your point about the lack of paperwork. We were a brand new children's part of Bloomsbury. We'd started from scratch. Those days you did a lot of telephoning, and emails were still very much in their infancy. So yeah, we didn't record very much. You know, Thomas Taylor says in the 25th edition, I rang him up to commission and described what I wanted. So, you know, a lot of it was just done and kind of hand to mouth. You know, we were in a hurry.
Right, and there is, as I said, there is very little, but it becomes more obvious for the second book. But you don't have any missing chapters then, unfortunately. I'll ask you again.
Sadly not. No.
That is a shame. Do we have any questions from? We'll probably deal with the floor first before we go online. But do you have any questions from the floor to ask Barry?
Quick question of Barry and the film, really. So the lack of archives. Do you know what's happening to JK's archive? Presumably, she has everything. You know what the story is?
Did you hear that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how much she actually has from those early days. She was, you know, not with very much money in the early days. She was writing somewhat in cafes in Edinburgh. We talked about the future that the book had, and I did give her the infamous advice which she teased me about for a very long time afterwards. I said, the thing is, Joe, you will never make any money from children's books, so you have to get a day job. So she says that's because I didn't have enough confidence, but no, I was just being avuncular, really. So I'm not sure what she kept and what she did.
But everything you always saw was typed, presumably, because the story that she was writing in a cafe suggests that it would be a longhand narrative rather than something that's typed up. Did she type it herself? Did she get? Did you get someone at Bloomsbury to type it, or?
No, I think she either typed it or someone at Christopher Little typed it.
Right.
So yeah, I mean, you know, I don't know what she kept, to be honest.
Large chunks of the book as cut by Barry Cunningham. That's what we're hoping. John, you had a question.
Yeah, Barry, you may not remember 25 years, but you you know what was cut in terms of anything to do with the plot or characters, or is it twofold that?
We speeded up some of the action sequences. So that's it. Obviously you'll notice, even to the most casual observer, that the first book is quite a lot tighter and smaller than subsequent books. But whenever you say, to fans around the world, I think maybe subsequent books became rather too long. They're saying, no, fans just want more. They don't want less. I think when your first relationship with your editor is a bit like, your first of any kind of relationship, and what you're allowed to do with your author because they trust you and because it's their first exploration of the world of print. I think subsequent editors perhaps don't have that level of freedom. If you've got the world's best-selling author, you don't really tell them to cut their work, do you?
But there certainly was a ballad of Nearly Headless Nick, wasn't there? That was,
yes.
Because I think Joe made a special feature of providing handwritten versions of that with a little note at the bottom saying "cruelly cut from the first draft."
Yes, well, that was probably me. It's probably me.
Yeah.
The thing is that right from the beginning, when we had lunch right at the beginning, and this does take on a certainly surreal aspect for me, because as we sat around, the very first time we met in London when she came down was that she told me in rough outline what was going to happen in subsequent books. I mean, because she asked me, right early on, how do you feel about sequels? And like all publishers, I must have looked shifty and said, let's just concentrate on this first one. So yeah, I mean, I'm sure, not uniquely, but she's always been, I guess she's been an Uber fan herself, she's as devoted to the characters, their background, their authenticity, what they do, what they think and what they feel, as her most avid fan, And some people, you'll know them maybe, certainly Phil will, when they have successful series, feel trapped within that series or feel bored by what they've created or cynical about it. To my knowledge, at least, none of those things apply to Jo.
Does that answer your question, John? Any other questions from the floor? They're all being very well behaved here, Barry. Rob, do we have any questions from the hundreds of people out there?
A question from user HP over the chat.
Can you hear this, Barry?
Yeah.
Lovely.
HP, and this might be as much for Phil as Barry. There was a rumor that there are various fakes of the first book. And have you encountered much in the way of forgeries while you've been on travel?
So I mentioned this earlier on. Yes, there is a fake. There are all sorts of fakes and forgeries going around, regrettably. Forged signatures is a particular favorite. The signature obviously adds a significant amount of value, and so people will try and forge that. And they range from laughably bad to really very competent indeed. But yes, you're right, there are forgeries of the books themselves, obviously, and of the first book, that is. Yeah, you need to know what you're doing. You need to know how to spot it. And it's remarkably good. It is a very, very good forgery, but it is a complete forgery, the text as well as the binding. There are ways of telling, and if you're going to buy a Harry Potter, I'm obviously going to say this, but buy it from a reputable source, because the unwary can certainly fall prey to the unscrupulous.
My very favorite ones come out. I mean, I'd like to collect these actually. Come out of Asia, and they're the Harry Potter sequels, Harry Potter and the Pirates and stuff like that. They're wonderful and strange. and
actually, you're right. There's a Chinese edition, I think, of Harry Potter and the Goblets of Fire, the Goblet of Fire had been announced as the title, but the text came out in this Chinese edition, and the story bears no relation to what was actually published. But it was an attempt to sell a significant number of copies to the Chinese market. I've seen one of those, and I couldn't understand a word of it, of course, but they certainly do exist. Yes.
One question from the Grizzly Wizard.
Right.
The question for Barry. Were there ever any plans for the first book to be illustrated like the Dahl books?
No, there weren't at that time. No, it's a pity, really. The first time I've ever seen the Quentin Blake Harry Potter that Phil showed and Voldemort. They are wonderful. So not at the time, I worked with Quincy when I worked with Roald Dahl, and it would have been a piece of wonderful inspiration had I thought of it, but I didn't. And, we didn't have the kind of budgets in those days.
An additional question, and there are actually some more popping up on the screen, which we can, which I can nip around and have a look at with you. But Mike asked if there was a point, Barry, that you realised really what you had in terms of such a successful series. Was there a point where the penny dropped for you and you realised quite what you were looking at?
Well, I don't know. The thing, like, I've been a children's editor for a while, and I think probably one of the secrets of being a children's editor is to believe passionately into the next thing that you're publishing, and that's the reason why you buy it, and that's the reason why you talk about it. I knew this was special from the beginning, and it sounds like a hokey story, but it is a true story. That just after the first book published, I went to my children's, I've got many children, but one of my children's teachers' evening, and an older child took us down, and she was holding the book. And so, like everybody would do, I nervously asked what she thought of it, and she did something which I've seen children around the world subsequently do. She hugged it, and she said, "I love this book." And it's the book huggers. It's when the book huggers strike, and it's almost like a physical relationship that they have with the work. It becomes emotionally important. Those are the days when I first started to realize that what I initially thought was right. It was a great children's book, and would really work because it was important to children. And as I said, I don't ever pretend that I knew it would be important to their grandparents as well.
But you left the series quite early on, didn't you? I mean, you only saw the first one through and then left on to other things. So it was only Philosopher's Stone that you it's only Philosopher's
Stone that I edited, and bought. It's a bit like, as I said in something recently, it's a bit like leaving the Beatles, but I really, for all the wonder of working for Bloomsbury, it's essentially an adult company. And in those days, I mean, I know they're highly valued now, but in those days, children's books were not highly valued, and we weren't well resourced. And indeed, the reason why I couldn't buy the American rights was that I was on a cap of money that I couldn't spend more than. So I wanted to start my own company, and obviously Harry Potter gave me the ability to do that. So even though it was sad to watch it kind of turn into the phenomenon, it's also a bit of a relief, that I could actually get on with other things, and I don't have to talk about Harry Potter my entire life.
We've got one question that's come in the chat, which is your favorite book? Have you got a favorite book from the
third one? I think the third one is my favorite of them all.
And for what reason?
I think it brings everything together, and I think it harnesses everything it's going to be, and the kind of real relationships. It just seems to be, the kind of explosion of all the best things that Harry can be.
And I think I agree with you. It's the plotting, it's the way that the strands come together. And actually, the movie doesn't do it any justice, does it?
No, the movies and the lunch boxes and the virtual worlds and the colouring books. It's difficult to take all that very seriously sometimes.
Have you ever had a Bertie Bott's every flavour bean?
No, I would
No.
love to.
And have you ever had a chocolate frog?
Well, sadly not. Maybe not. But that would be a dream, wouldn't it?
Any other questions from outside the shop or inside the shop? No, I think we're drawing to a conclusion. So I'd just like, if you stay on there, Barry, I'd like to say obviously thank you. Collecting Harry Potter has many intricacies, and a friendly book dealer can help navigate the potential traps. There are some spectacular Harry Potter and J.K. Rowling pieces available, and we at Peter Harrington seek them out. So as the Flu Network is severely strained tonight, it only remains for me to thank Barry Cunningham, my wonderful colleagues, Rachel, Rob, Doreen and Pom, and you, the audience, virtual and actual, for attending. Thanks very much.
Thank you.